Good morning, everybody, and thank you for attending the Bio-Africa Digital Convention 2021. This is track 1, which specifically looks at universal access to healthcare through innovation. And the main topic for this session is vaccines in Africa. This promises to be a very exciting 1 hour of deliberations, and we look forward to that. We really have a duty to protect all our people as we look forward to universal coverage by 2030. And we hope at the end of this session, we will have discussed issues of access in the background of universal healthcare. COVID-19 has provided us not only with challenges, but opportunities as we march together towards universal access. And for me, there are main issues that we will have to look at today is the issue of emerging variants and how we move on with second-generation vaccines. Most importantly, how do we harness the power of collaboration amongst ourselves? Remembering that actually we have the experience to run vaccination campaigns in Africa, and looking also at the lessons learned from the global influenza surveillance and response systems. So how do we move forward together? How do we also comprehensively and visibly deal with issues of vaccine equity and fair vaccine allocation? Because as the WHO says, no one is safe until we're all safe. And lastly, how do we win back the trust of our communities? We really have work to do in the face of the massive misinformation campaign that is going on out there in the social media space. We have a great lineup of speakers for you. And as they introduce them, we would like them to switch their videos on. We hope to have a great Q&A session at the end. So each presenter will have about 8 to 10 minutes of presentations. At the end of all 4 presentations, then we'll have a Q&A session for about 20 to 30 minutes. May I take this opportunity then to introduce our speakers today. We will have Dr. Martin Friedrich, who leads vaccine research at the WHO and is based in Geneva, Switzerland. Prior to this position, he has held several other positions, including leading technology transfer activities and research on therapeutics for Ebola. We also have Mr. Patrick Thibault on the panel. He's head of science and innovation at biotech and director at African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative. We also are happy to welcome Mr. Stavros Nicolaou to the panel, who is the Aspen Pharmacare Group Senior Executive responsible for strategic development. Stavros has over 26 years experience in the international and pharmaceutical industry. He also serves on several industry-associated executives and structures, and is a well-known speaker at many conferences. Welcome, Stavros. And we will then hear from Dr. Tshepo Tshekwa, who is a principal researcher on developing production processes for biologics manufacturer at bench and pilot scale. Dr. Tshekwa's study has been on applied biotechnology. Dr. Tshepo has also completed training in infectious diseases and molecular medicine at UCT prior to joining the CSIR. It gives me great pleasure to welcome the panel members, and we really look forward to engaging with you. The first speaker that's going to go on then is Dr. Martin Friedrich, if he has already joined us. I see he has. Please take it over, Martin.
Okay, thank you very much.
And thank you for your time.
Thank you. And so thank you very much for inviting me to this. So just to add to what's already been said, just that you know, I am a graduate of, I got my PhD at the University of Cape Town. So it's a great pleasure for me to be once again trying to support African medical development and specifically access to healthcare. I'm just going to say a few words really about access to healthcare seen from the WHO perspective, and particularly for vaccines. So access, we've got to think of three components. Is the product available? Is the product affordable? And is the product appropriate? And this is the basis of the challenges to access. For COVID vaccines, one of the biggest problems that we're facing is it's not available. And so how would we make it available? Well, one way to make it available would be to have it being produced locally. So we've seen over the last several months, last 20 months actually, there's been a lot of vaccine nationalism, that countries that produce the vaccine have said, well, we don't want this being exported until our countries all of our population are vaccinated. So one way to overcome this is to have it produced in many countries, and that this is something that we're really working on to try and get this done. But there's no point getting it being produced locally if it is not affordable. So we've got several cases of products being made locally where the cost of producing things locally is actually greater than the cost of buying them on the international market. So this is a caveat that I really want to highlight, that in trying to promote access through local production, which is an avenue which we really support, we must be very careful that local production is not more expensive. And why could it be more expensive? It's because when these big multinationals are producing drugs, vaccines, they're doing so in huge facilities at a huge scale. And they're able to have this huge scale because they're exporting all around the world. So the risk for some countries, and South Africa is a classical example of the type of country where this could come into play, is that the facility might be a medium-sized facility or even a small-sized facility. And the drugs that come out of a small facility, whether it be vaccines or biotherapeutics, if they're coming from a small facility, they tend to cost a lot more to produce in small facilities. So we could make them available, but they would not then be affordable. Now, the third component is making sure that these vaccines, that the drugs or the vaccines are appropriate. So typically when the research and development is being done in Europe or in America, which is where most of the vaccine research is being done right now, the people doing this R&D, they don't have a very good idea of what is really required. And so they might be going for a vaccine that is suitable for a European population, for an American population, and they'll be needing to have something that is covering either the strains that are European American, not African, or they will be looking at something which is so complex that it will not be readily usable in the African context. So this is where we really need to be supporting local R&D to ensure that we are making vaccines that are appropriate for the local setting. So local production is an approach that WHO really favors to ensure that we are able to promote access. And in the past 20 years, and Patrick Tipo, that will be talking after me, we've worked together on, for example, access to influenza vaccines through promoting at least some level of production of influenza vaccines in the low and middle income countries. But there is no point talking about local production if the reagents that you need to make this locally still need to be imported from Africa, from America or from Europe. So a big project that has just been recently announced and launched with Afrigen and BioVac in South Africa is the production of the mRNA vaccines. So we'll be establishing Afrigen and BioVac as a technology transfer hub and production center for mRNA vaccines. But if the reagents to make the mRNA need to come from Europe or America, this means that in the event of a future pandemic and these reagents are in short supply, Africa will once again be at the end of the queue saying, we can't get the vaccine from Europe, we can't even get the reagents to make the vaccine. So when we talk about local production, we need to be thinking beyond just the know-how of how to make the product. We need to talk about the know-how of how to make the reagents to make the product. So I just want to highlight that. Now then, affordability, mRNA vaccines as an example, these are going to be expensive. So could we be making vaccines that are more appropriate for Africa, for example, using a newer technology for mRNA vaccines where we need much less mRNA, for example, using the self-replicating mRNA, just as an example, to reduce the cost of the vaccines to make this more suitable for the low and the middle income countries in Africa. And then we come down once again to appropriate. As you will know, many of the mRNA vaccines currently on the market, they require to be stored at minus 70 degrees Celsius. Well, this means that the delivery of these vaccines in Africa is very complicated. And so here, what we would like to see is R&D taking place in Africa to develop a thermostable vaccine, which is more suitable for use in Africa. So I'd like to just give now some thoughts on some strengths and weaknesses from, this is my personal perspective, having been brought up in Southern Africa and now living in Europe and seeing how many countries have adapted their access to healthcare. So the strength of South Africa is clearly the university. South Africa has 9 of the 10 top universities in Africa. This is a huge strength for South Africa. South Africa has among the best clinical trial infrastructure in the world. There's many people come to South Africa to do clinical trials. But when those clinical trials are done, they then take their products back to Europe or America and license them and either don't sell them to South Africa or sell them at very high price. So we've got that infrastructure, but we're not using it appropriately. There's a very educated population, which is fantastic compared to many of the rest of Africa, many parts of the rest of Africa. And South Africa is essentially a middle-income country with adequate resources. So why historically has South Africa not been able to make a huge proportion of its own drugs? And this is where we're going to see that South Africa is actually in a difficult situation because it is actually a relatively small country with a relatively small internal market. Well, now you could argue Singapore is also a small country with a very small internal market. So how did Singapore achieve a huge local manufacturing capacity with good access, while South Africa has not done so? And my first thought here is that this requires something which is rare in many of the emerging economies, which is a 20-year plan, not a 4-year plan. Many politicians just see what's going to be done during my tenureship, whereas in Singapore, they built a 20-year plan of looking forwards a long way. Now, even if we had a 20-year plan, one of the challenges is going to be, will a facility be sustainable in South Africa? Because the wealthy component of South Africa is relatively small. And then the rest of South Africa is relatively poor, and then the rest of Africa is relatively poor. So in order for a facility to be sustainable, it is going to need to export, and ideally export to other middle-income countries or even high-income countries if possible. And this is going to require that people have confidence in the drug or the vaccine coming out of South Africa. And this is going to require a very strong regulatory agency. So when I look at the priorities of what needs to be done, we need to focus on building the regulatory agency in South Africa to make it absolutely rock solid so that all of the rest of Africa and the rest of the world have complete confidence in drugs that are being made in South Africa. But I also want to mention something which I see happening right now. I would really like to push that we avoid neo-colonialism. I really would be disappointed if we see companies coming to South Africa, which I believe is taking place at this very moment, and we say, we're going to produce the drug in South Africa. But when the drug's being produced in South Africa, it's not the South Africans that get to decide where it is sold or where it is used, because the colonialist originator then says, we, having made the drugs in South Africa, we're now sending them back to Europe or back to America. So it's very important that when we allow companies to come into the country, we ensure that this is done through an empowerment. South Africa needs to be empowered to make the decisions itself of what is produced and when it's produced, where it is sold, and who it is given to. We need to start, so I'd really like to emphasize the great pleasure that I see as I see Aspen now producing vaccines from Johnson & Johnson. BioVac has just signed a deal with Pfizer and BioNTech to be producing mRNA vaccines, and WHO has just appointed Afrigen and BioVac as this is the first ever in the world, an mRNA technology transfer hub. So South Africa is getting its foot very firmly on the ladder, but I would like to point out that it's not going to be easy sailing, and we've got a lot of work to do together. So I stop there and pass it back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Friedrich. Very challenging. challenging indeed. And yeah, we've got to own the process and produce for our own. Thank you very much. I'm going to call on the next speaker now, who's Mr. Patrick Tipo, to take it on. If we have questions, please, we will have a Q&A session at the end. Start preparing your questions now. Mr. Patrick Tipo, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Are you able to hear me?
Very clearly. Go ahead. Thank you.
Excellent. So thanks a lot. And it's indeed a privilege for me to share some thoughts with respect to this important and topical subject now. And I think Martin and I have had a long journey together. So it's not going to be surprising that a lot of the thoughts that he shared will be repeated to some extent or echoed in the presentation that I'm going to share. So I think the first point that I'd like to make is thinking about vaccines in Africa. We need to think about vaccines not as one big basket, but the components of vaccines that we need to focus on. Now, Martin's made the point quite powerfully that access to vaccines is a critical driver of access to universal health. Vaccines, as we know, have played a major part in dealing with infectious diseases over many, many decades. So access to vaccines is absolutely important. But we need to think about vaccines possibly in the following way, which has been articulated by many others, including the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing, led by the African CDC. And so COVID vaccines have grabbed our attention for obvious reasons. But I think that this conversation needs to be emphasized, that the conversation needs to focus on vaccines beyond COVID as well. And so obviously we need to think about future pandemic vaccines beyond COVID that might be relevant not only globally, but to Africa as well. We need to focus on vaccines that might be regionally relevant to Africa, where we have a burden of a disease in Africa that's not experienced elsewhere, Lassa fever, for example. And then very importantly, we need to think of routine vaccines. And while we are heavily geared in our efforts to focus on COVID vaccines, we need to appreciate that when focusing on developing vaccine production capacity, that what I'd like to say is there are two sides to the same coin. And that is, the one side is building the capacity, and the other side is sustaining the capacity. And we've seen that in the midst of COVID, that first of all, richer countries and countries that had embedded capacity for routine vaccine production were best positioned to launch off in an accelerated way to build a capacity for COVID vaccines and repurpose facilities, repurpose capabilities, workforce, etc. And this is largely based on routine vaccination and the production of vaccines for routine vaccination. So when we apply our minds to the lack of capacity in Africa triggered by COVID, one needs to be reminded that this is a conversation that has taken place over many years, 10 or 15 years, about Africa's lack of capacity for routine vaccines, leading to this vulnerability in the face of a pandemic. And COVID-19 has confronted us with that reality in a very sober way. So it's COVID vaccines, it's future pandemic vaccines, it's African relevant vaccines and routine vaccines. and that we need to focus therefore on the development of capability for routine vaccines, build the ecosystem in such a way that it is enabling for routine vaccine production, and that would include the regulatory capacity, the development of a competent and capable workforce with respect to the quality management system, the full total array of systems required in a production environment to produce a vaccine. So it's not only what we would call the science of manufacture, but it's also the quality assurance, the quality control, the regulatory drivers involved there as well. With respect to sustainability, I think that it's important to remind ourselves that within this attempt at building an enabling ecosystem, we need to examine the current procurement mechanisms prevailing in Africa, and the way that has shaped the market. We know that UNICEF and Gavi have done sterling work over many years in ensuring that much needed vaccines are available to African countries to administer these life-saving vaccines to their children. And this has had major positive impact. But it's time to step back, in my opinion, and examine the way this is incentivizing, encouraging or not encouraging the establishment of local capacity on the continent, and whether we can become creative and innovative in changing that paradigm and reworking the procurement mechanisms to incentivize the establishment of local capacity. And this leads to the point of market certainty. So if we can also guarantee to an extent that local capabilities dotted around Africa through private companies, private-public partnerships, or even public institutions would not be wasted in terms of creating a white elephant and then not having a market to feed, because it's the market certainty that will produce the sustainability. The other critical point which I'd like to make is the need to also consider vaccine research and development. We know that currently, as Martin has pointed out, access to vaccines has been a problem, has been a challenge, and that this has resulted in a push for the establishment of local vaccine manufacturing capacity, and that is taking place in a stepwise fashion with focus on formulation and filling, or what people call fill finish. And then hopefully over time, it's also to embed the manufacture of what is called drug substance, or the active pharmaceutical ingredient. So the full vaccine value chain manufacturing capability. But the point to note about that is, while it is critically important for this to be established on the continent at scale, it still depends on a partnership where someone else needs to give you the technology in order to produce. So over the long term, and again, to use Martin's words, we need to think of a 20, 30, or 40-year game plan that we are considering, with the necessary commitments, politically, financial, and otherwise behind this. That we need to drive this right up the value chain into vaccine R&D to ensure that doesn't have to be done in an exclusive way, but to a greater and increasing extent over time, that product is also researched and developed on the continent to feed into continental manufacturing capability. And I think with that, I shall pause and hand back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Yeah, you also raise important issues for me thinking beyond COVID. I think we really need to be thinking in those long-term future pandemics and how we manage that when we come to that. As I said, we'll come back to Q&A and we'll probably raise a few questions there. Can I now call on Mr. Stavros Nicolau to take over?
Program Director.
Over to you.
Thank you. Program Director and fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen, good morning or good afternoon, depending on which part of the world you're in at the moment. It's indeed a great pleasure to join this panel to share some thoughts on what are one of the more critical conversations for humanity at the moment, that of securing vaccine supplies, but more importantly, securing health for the African continent. It will not surprise any of you that my comments are going to support and complement what both Martin and Patrick have said earlier. My perspective is virtually identical. I would like to, however, unpack one or two dimensions in a little more detail. And I think the starting point for any type of conversation of this nature is to recognize some of the statistics. The first statistic that I think is critical, and you've heard this many times, but worth reinforcing on this call as well, is that Africa remains a serial importer of both pharmaceuticals, diagnostics, and vaccines. It is an indictment that the continent that has the most disproportionate disease burden of any continent is also the one that is most dependent on imports to secure to ensure its health security. If you were looking at any other sector or any other goods or services, it certainly would not make sense, and it doesn't make sense here either. The issue, however, has been, despite many plans and a lot of talk over many years, when it comes to implementation and execution of localization and or local procurement strategies, the continent has been found wanting, and even our own country here in South Africa has been found wanting. So despite acts of parliament, regulations that have been amended to facilitate localization and local procurement, despite all of this, when it comes to implementing same, both in the private and public sector, there's an inability to execute and deliver on what is a core localization mandate for the country. I also raise this in the context of the balance that one needs to find as any country between the public health imperative in the one instance, and then secondly, the localization benefits to any economy. Now, we know that any economy, particularly one that is characterized by gross inequalities that we see in our own country here in South Africa. We see an economy that has been significantly impacted by COVID. It's certainly trailing other economies globally. Manufacturing and localization is at the front and center of South Africa's economic recovery plan. And of course, when you have a pharmaceutical sector that is not only a sector that can contribute to the economy, the labor, the productivity of the country, but also to the public health of the country, then this is one of the sectors that should be pursuing the most active of localization agendas, and unfortunately it's not. So let me move on to the second statistic. The second statistic is, and the program director has already enumerated on this, at last count, 4.9 billion doses of COVID vaccine had been administered globally. And again, another sad indictment, both on the world and on humanity, is that less than 2% of those vaccines have found their way into African arms. Consequences, again, I'm not going to speak to the obvious public health consequences, but this is also the continent. And if I look at South Africa, which is, as I indicated earlier, showing minimal economic growth off a significantly reduced base. One of the priorities, if not the biggest priority in our country, is to vaccinate as many people as swiftly as possible, so that we not only deal with future variants that are unpredictable, more contagious very often, but also that we're able to start opening up our economy. And in particular, opening up your economy means that you have to start dealing with international investors, international trade partners. Now, those trade partners are going to be reluctant to trade with you, to come and invest, unless you've got significant parts of your population vaccinated. So how does Africa pull out from this morass? Because if you've got almost 5 billion doses that have been administered globally, and Africa's contribution of that is less than 2%, it puts Africa on the back foot with economic recovery, with opening up its economies, and it also places Africa in an invidious position vis-a-vis a fourth wave. So it's an absolute priority that we vaccinate as many people as a continent before the onset of third and fourth waves. Some countries have already experienced a third wave. We've seen a vicious third wave in East Africa, by way of example. In some of our neighboring countries, Botswana and Namibia, we've also seen a significant impact with the ever contagious third wave. The third wave in our very own country, which is still in motion, regrettably, has been the most contagious. It's had the highest mortality rates of its preceding first and second waves. So these are some of the statistics that don't augur well for the future. And these are statistics that both Martin and Patrick have also acknowledged, and certainly the program director. So what do we do to solve this problem? Because as all the previous speakers have indicated, it's not just about a COVID vaccine. We, of course, don't know what the future format and shape of the COVID market will look like. Many people are discussing the future as being booster shots, a regular seasonal vaccine like you have with influenza. We don't quite know what the future looks like. But what we do know is that vaccines are here to stay on the African continent and the rest of the world. Vaccines have been proven, despite some of the anti-vaccine. I'm not going to get into any anti-vax messages on this call, what social media is saying and doing. But suffice to say that vaccines have been demonstrated over many decades to be the most effective way of preventing disease. Aside from purifying water and having drinkable water, there's no other better or more effective measure of dealing with a pandemic than vaccinations. Vaccinations keep populations healthy. we have one of the most disproportionate disease burdens. We need to solve this problem, not just for the COVID vaccine on the continent, but more broadly for other vaccines as well. 99% of all vaccines are imported into Africa. Only 1% or less are manufactured on the continent. There's an ambitious plan. For the first time, I'm seeing Africa pulling together and aggregating both resources and volumes. And here I must pay tribute to the African Vaccine Acquisition Task Team and the platform that Strive Masayiwa and his team have built up and established. It's the first time I'm starting to see where plans are beginning to be executed. I've spoke at length about that we've been speaking a lot of plans, but implementing very little. We failed at the execution steps, and I'm seeing now for the first time a real execution taking place with the COVID Vaccine Acquisition Task Team. How to solve the problem? I'm going to speak from an Aspen's perspective now. Aspen Pharmacare is Africa's largest pharmaceutical manufacturer. Aspen has invested over many years in establishing strong sterile capabilities and capacities in our facility in Kabeja, formerly Port Elizabeth, in the Eastern Cape. Aspen has manufacturing assets in a number of countries in the African continent, significant in South Africa, as you would expect, Cape Town, Kabeja, and East London. We have manufacturing facilities in Ghana, the West African region. In East Africa, we have plants in Kenya and Tanzania. So we're fairly well represented across the continent. At the beginning or the onset of the pandemic, we looked at how we could best try and solve this problem. And we realized we had existing capacities, albeit that they're manufacturing general anesthetics. We are one of the world's largest producers of general anesthetic products, muscle relaxants. These are products that were in high demand, continue to be so during COVID, because naturally they are required to ventilate patients. So let me address probably the biggest elephant in the room always, and that is Africans often don't believe in their own capabilities. The rest of the world doesn't believe in our own capabilities. So it can be done. We can do this. And Aspen has demonstrated this. So during the first and second waves, it was Aspen that was providing general anesthetics, muscle relaxants, dexamethasone to European patients. Usually it's Africa that's finding around the world trying to get critical medicine inventories. Here the tables were reversed. It was the French president and prime minister phoning, the Italian prime minister phoning and saying, our patients are in desperate need. Can you please try and assist? So it was an African company assisting European and other patients, African patients, etc. So I'm trying to demonstrate that we can do things. We've got products that can be trusted, and we've got products that can find their way into arms of patients or into critical care settings anywhere in the world. We should never doubt neither our abilities nor our capabilities, as I've just demonstrated. So let me start ending off, because I can talk indefinitely on this topic and I don't wish to. But can I say that when we looked at how we respond as an Aspen management team to the looming pandemic, we realized that we could allocate parts of our existing steriles capacity to fill and finish, as Patrick outlined it earlier. And we looked around who would be the most appropriate partner. Johnson & Johnson was a partner we had worked with previously. And I know this is well documented and well rehearsed globally, but we were able to secure contract manufacturing partnership with Johnson & Johnson. This is the first step of many that's required to give you autonomy and independence on the African continent. Johnson & Johnson have invested in building capacity on the continent. But as I said, this is a step. What we need as a continent, and Johnson & Johnson have committed to this, is we need licenses. Licenses mean that you own the intellectual property as the manufacturer. You get into technology transfer arrangements, know-how transfer arrangements, and when and if necessary, skills transfer arrangements. So I'm very pleased to say that, yeah.
I'm going to ask you to wrap up now so that we give Dr.
30
Sekwe
seconds.
time.
30 seconds. So I'm pleased to say that we have now, as Aspen, produced the Johnson & Johnson COVID vaccine for South Africa and the rest of Africa. These doses have already found their way into the African continent. They found their way into South African arms. And it demonstrates that we do have, as I said earlier, both the capacity and the capability to produce these vaccines. I'm also pleased to say that even though we're importing drug substance out of Europe, 60% of what gets produced in Q3, this quarter, will be for South African and African patients. And then in Q4, which starts October, 100% of production from Aspen's facility will be for African patients only. It can be done. We can do it. We just need to have courage of our convictions and also belief in ourselves. Program Director, it's been a great pleasure speaking to all of you this morning. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Stavros. Thank you very much for the words of encouragement and hope, and we'll come back for another discussion with you. I'm going to allow Dr. Sekwe to give his talk.
Thank you very much, Program Director. I'd like to express gratitude for the organizers for allowing us to also make a contribution to this session, and we're very proud to be part of this session. Involving really people I recognize as leaders in this area of work. I have a few slides. I'm not sure if they will be projected or they can be projected, but they were just intended to gather my thoughts. And the delight of talking last is that, much of the time you find some coherence in the story, and many of the speakers before me have already made the case for a local capability for vaccine innovation. And the case is really quite compelling. Where I'd like to place emphasis as a person coming from relatively early in the value chain is where that we need to utilize the pandemic that has really caused a lot of chaos in our society as an opportunity that we can seize to support entry of new players into the sector, and also as an opportunity to ultimately redress inequality in the broader society. Because of course, with the urgency that we've seen in all sectors, we know that we are able to do more much quicker, and we are able to also attract resources and a lot of work to our area. So the second thing is that, we do realize that there will be a sustained and long-term need for COVID vaccines and other vaccines, as already mentioned by the previous speakers, and because of emerging variants and because of the uncertainty around boosters, we know for sure that a local capability will be required to tackle the future, and to also tackle future pandemic from other infectious agents. We really know that if we enhance our innovation in vaccine production, we can be better prepared when another virus or other disease comes along. We also need to realize more value from the value chain, of course, by supporting R&D and by starting earlier, and by developing our own IP, we are less dependent on international markets, which is risky and unsustainable. And by the way, we can also mitigate some economic benefits. So what is my view of what we need to advance this cause? We have seen Operation Warp Speed in the US And by the way, some of the outcomes of that are also reaching our borders. I know that there are clinical trials in the Cape from some of the vaccines produced in that same program. We should really commit to a similar approach with a rapid innovation ecosystem. But the main issue is that we must be meticulously coordinated. I've observed, where I sit in the R&D part of the value chain, that in some instances there's duplication. There's competition, and with the limited resources that are available, I think that is unproductive. And so a coordination would be something that would help us to really, move forward with developing a capability. I must also stress that my view is that South Africa and the continent do have really a relatively mature and strong R&D capability that we must leverage. We must, utilize this for our benefit and start developing our own IP. I recognize, and really we do celebrate, and we do acknowledge the great strides being taken in terms of localization of technologies and in terms of the reverse integration fill and finish strategy. And we really are proud of what is happening. Martin also mentioned the mRNA hub developments that we really are proud to see happening. But certainly my view is that we need more support for earlier parts of the value chain to advance what I would call homegrown solutions, so that we do capture the value much more. If we support, R&D and process development and, create infrastructure that is open access, and can produce testing, clinical testing grade material, I think it would greatly enhance our local capability. I know others have already mentioned the importance of human capital development in order to, create a skilled workforce for quality, for production, for all aspects of the vaccine capability. I think that if we do support these R&D hubs, we will also create a very strong, skilled workforce for the purpose. As I head towards the end, as a scientist in the room, I thought just to iterate and to mention that actually technology choices can really advance, the generation of fit-for-purpose vaccines for Africa. I think that it would be good for us to have more influence and define a uniquely suitable target product profile. I think Martin mentioned this with different emphasis earlier on, and knowing full well about the requirements, for cold chain and sometimes high cost of goods for mRNA platforms. What about other strategies? What about subunit vaccines? Where, by the way, we do have quite strong existing local R&D capability. The issue of utilizing novel technologies to formulate, vaccines for Africa, to mitigate cold chain stability, for simpler distribution, different means of delivery. I think those would really advance a more fit for purpose African vaccine that we can be proud of. I just wanted to mention that it is possible to do so. We've seen just last week on Friday that Cuba has approved their second subunit-based vaccine, for emergency use in Cuba, and also I think in Iran a month earlier. And we've also seen news around the work we've done with Cape Bio around diagnostics. Of course, diagnostics is simpler, and the regulatory hurdles and the development hurdles are lower. But we've shown that if we direct resources to the right purpose and to the right hands, these things can be realized. Just to conclude and to say that our emphasis would be on partnership to create homegrown solutions with the goal of broadening access to cost-effective medicines for Africa. I think the issue of defining a target product profile that's fit for purpose for Africa is something that's critical, and consensus on this would be good, because then we can develop in a coordinated manner for something that we believe would be useful. I just want to also mention, it's not a big announcement, but we have started to make strides at the CSIR to support, established industry and SMMEs and universities and other players with an open access and multi-purpose, CGMP process development piloting facility. Just the first phase of support has been secured, but we are looking for more partnerships for this. But I think what this will do is to really create a place where, you know, new IP can be created by Africans for Africans. I think I'll stop there, Professor Mawela, and thank you very much for the opportunity once again.
Thank you, Dr. Tsekwa, and thank you to all the speakers. We've gone over time, but it was important to hear all of you and what you had to say about this. So I only have 10 minutes of Q&A, and there's already questions in the chat box. Let me check. There's an affirmation that skills and legit regulatory systems are critical for us moving forward, and I'm sure all the speakers covered that. There is a question, and I don't know who in the panel is going to take that one. What do you all make of Dr. Malone, who invented the mRNA vaccine, that it should not continue to be administered to humans? Anyone in the panel?
I am very happy to take this on.
Thank you
very happy. So I think I'm going to be blunt here and possibly quite rude. There are a lot of nutcases out there. And unfortunately, some of these nutcases have got medical degrees. We have seen Nobel Prize winners saying that mRNA vaccines are very dangerous. Now, Dr. Malone, I know Dr. Malone well, both personally and professionally. He did contribute a little bit to some early discovery that mRNA can be expressed in cells, extraneous mRNA. He did not invent the mRNA vaccine, so let's get that clear. And his arguments that this should not continue to be administered in humans, this is criminal. I really think that people that have medical degrees that go out making such unfounded statements, there should actually be a law making this a crime. This is my personal opinion, but I believe that WHO would agree that what Dr. Malone is saying is absolute, complete, evidence-free nonsense. Over.
Fully supported, Martin, and very well put.
Thank you. Yeah, that raised a bit of a temperature, but you're right. And as I said in my introduction, how do we as a community of scientists mitigate against all this concerted disinformation campaign that's going on so that we win back the trust of our people? How are we going to do that?
So let me please just weigh in. So first of all, from the WHO perspective, all policy must be based on evidence. So when WHO, and then following WHO SAGE recommendations, this comes to the RITAGs, the Regional Immunization Technical Advisory Groups, then to the NITAGs, the National Immunization Technical Advisory Groups. This is based on evidence of does the vaccine work and is the risk benefit in the balance of the benefit. We must be able to point out that it's very easy for anybody to stand up and say that drinking water is bad for you or whatever other nonsense they want. We must be able to stand up and say this is evidence-free. There is a lot of nonsense medicine out there. It's been going, we've had nonsense medicine for hundreds of years. Unfortunately, now with the platforms, the YouTubes, the TikToks and things like that, these people that are able to express their evidence-free views, we must be able to use evidence to refute that evidence-free view. And I want to re-emphasize, it is I'm very distraught when I see medical doctors just inventing out of their own heads without any training behind a non-consensual view. So I think we just have to point out that it is non-consensual and it is evidence-free. Over.
Thank you. Stavros, may I ask you a question? How do we as Africa begin to wean ourselves from the serial importer mode? Any concrete steps that we need to take? And how do we reclaim our space in the vaccine production space?
Okay, thanks very much. I think that is an excellent question and goes to the core of today's discussion. For me, the two most important things we need to we need to address is, firstly, we need to establish a mindset of can be done and supporting local. We have for many years on the continent, we've been saying this, but we very often don't really believe it ourselves. And that's why I went to great lengths to spell out what Aspen has done, because Aspen is an African company on the tip of the African continent. And this is a company that is supplying critical medicines to all markets around the world. So the first thing is we need to have a belief and a mindset that it can be done. The second thing we need is we've always provided volumes to other countries and or other continents for them to benefit from our economies of scale. So good case in point, let's take the vaccine example. We need to vaccinate around 820 million Africans, the COVID vaccine. And what have we done? We're busy importing it from many other countries because we've put at their disposal our volumes. So we've said, here's 820 million, which is not an insignificant number in the global context. And we've said, here's 820 million. Now you dial that into your own production plans. You get the economies of scale. You create the jobs locally. You get the tax benefits locally. So we need to start aggregating our volumes and having an aggregated approach, pooled approach, if you want to call it, to procurement, so that we can optimize. You know, Martin made a very good point earlier. He said, well, it's no use producing locally if you're going to be twice or 3 or 4 times the price of an imported product. You need to be competitive. Now, the only way you can be competitive in manufacturing is through economies of scale. So we need that mechanism on a continental basis to leverage our full volumes so that we optimize and grow capacities on the continent. Those 2 things for me are the most important things we could be doing right now.
Okay. Thanks. I've already been threatened with time. That's going to end now. May I take this opportunity to thank each and one of you on the panel. It was really worth our time. We have challenges facing us of local capabilities, but making these coordinated, collaboratives, looking at partnerships. Also important that we look beyond COVID, look in the long term, and most importantly, believe in ourselves. As everybody on the panel has so rightly said, it is possible, and we have to do it in order to improve the lives of our people. Thank you very much, and may you all have a good day.